First class has standards, and you don't fit them? Janet sneered, dropping 2 plastic cups of water in front of Olivia and Nia while others sipped champagne. Passengers shifted in uneasy silence, unaware that the twins' father, one of the airline's most powerful investors, was sitting just across the aisle, ready to turn her cruelty into the most expensive mistake of her career. Olivia and Nia Williams sat frozen in their plush leather seats, boarding passes clutching in trembling hands as flight attendant Janet Morrison towered over them with a predatory smile that reeked of calculated cruelty. The cabin erupted in shocked gasps. Passengers' heads snapped up from their phones, some fumbling to start recording, while others desperately avoided eye contact, pretending they hadn't witnessed this blatant act of racial humiliation. A businessman in row 3 whispered to his wife, "Did she really just say that?" An elderly woman covered her mouth in horror. Others shifted uncomfortably, their privilege allowing them the luxury of looking away from injustice. But across the narrow aisle, a distinguished black man in an impeccably tailored suit observed every venomous word, every degrading gesture, his piercing eyes cataloging each moment of injustice with laser focus. His hands remained perfectly still on his armrests, but those who knew Patrick Williams would recognize the deadly calm that preceded his most devastating legal victories. Janet Morrison had no clue that her racist performance was being witnessed by someone who could destroy her career with a single phone call. She had no idea that those 2 little girls she was terrorizing were about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her miserable life. And she certainly didn't know that the silent man across the aisle owned enough airline stock to ground every plane in the fleet, because 3 days earlier, these weren't just any teenagers preparing for a flight. These were champions, survivors, and daughters of greatness who had earned their place through pure excellence in a world determined to deny them opportunities. Let me take you back to where this incredible story of courage really begins, in a moment that would change everything. Welcome back to Black and Bruised Stories. If you're new here, you've just joined a community dedicated to truth, justice, and survival. Show some love by clicking the like and subscribe button. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. The Williams Mansion in Atlanta's most exclusive Buckhead neighborhood buzzed with electric excitement that only comes when impossible dreams transform into golden reality. Olivia and Nia Williams bounced around their marble kitchen like pinballs of pure joy. Acceptance letters to the National Youth Leadership Summit scattered across the granite countertop like tickets to destiny itself. This wasn't just any academic program. The National Youth Leadership Summit selected only 50 students nationwide, future presidents, Nobel laureates, Supreme Court justices. The competition was so fierce that Harvard admissions looked like a participation trophy by comparison. And these 2 sisters had not only been accepted, they'd received full scholarships based on achievements that left seasoned educators speechless. Olivia, the analytical powerhouse with lightning-quick reflexes honed by countless debate victories, could barely contain the fire burning in her chest. Her bedroom walls screamed success, debate championship trophies gleaming like gold from battles where she dismantled opponents twice her age with surgical precision. Academic honor certificates layered thick as armor, evidence of a mind that absorbed complex legal concepts faster than most law students. At 13, she'd been the youngest student ever to win the National High School Debate Championship, arguing constitutional law with such mastery that federal judges in attendance offered her internships on the spot. Her analytical mind didn't just process information, it weaponized facts into arguments so airtight they left opponents questioning their own positions. Beside her, Nia pressed her beloved journal against her heart, every worn page filled with stories that had captivated judges and teachers across multiple states. This wasn't just any teenager scribbling diary entries. This was an award-winning storyteller whose narratives painted worlds so vivid they left readers breathless, crying, and demanding sequels. Her observant eyes missed nothing, capturing human behavior with the precision of a documentary filmmaker. She'd won the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards 3 years running, her pieces published in literary magazines that typically featured college graduates. Her short story about a young girl navigating racial prejudice had been optioned by a major film studio, making her the youngest writer ever to achieve such recognition. But these brilliant minds had been forged in the fires of unimaginable tragedy that would have broken weaker spirits. 2 years earlier, cancer had ripped their mother away, Dr. Hannah Williams, a phenomenal woman who'd been the first black neurosurgeon at Emory University. She'd performed groundbreaking surgeries while raising two daughters, instilling in them an unbreakable truth. Their voices mattered, their presence commanded respect, and their worth was never up for debate. The night before she died, weak from chemotherapy, but fierce in spirit, Dr. Williams had whispered to her daughters, "The world will try to make you small. Some people will look at your skin and assume you don't belong in rooms you've earned the right to enter. When that happens, remember you carry my strength, your father's wisdom, and your own unbreakable spirit. Never let anyone dim your light." Those words had become their battle cry, their armor against a world that seemed determined to test their resolve at every turn. If you're already feeling the power building in this incredible story of resilience and courage, smash that subscribe button because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless and probably in tears. Their father, Patrick Williams, wrapped both daughters in a bear hug that radiated pure paternal pride, mixed with fierce protective instinct. But Patrick wasn't just any grieving widower raising brilliant daughters. He was a civil rights attorney who'd built a tech empire worth hundreds of millions. A man whose quiet demeanor masked the kind of devastating influence that could topple governments or, as Janet Morrison would soon discover, freeze entire airlines mid-flight. Patrick had spent 15 years in courtrooms dismantling systemic racism with methodical precision, winning landmark cases that changed federal policy. His legal victories had disaggregated school districts, forced corporations to pay billions in discrimination settlements, and sent racist officials to federal prison. But after his wife's death, he pivoted to technology, channeling his analytical mind into ventures that revolutionized everything they touched. His investment portfolio read like a who's who of American industry. Major stakes in airlines, hotel chains, tech companies, and media conglomerates. He preferred to move through the world as an observer rather than a wielder of obvious power, understanding that true influence came from strategic silence rather than public displays of wealth. "You earn this through pure excellence," he told his daughters that evening, his voice thick with emotion that threatened to crack his composed exterior. "Every person who doubted you, every teacher who underestimated you, every challenge thrown your way, you conquered it all with your brilliance. Tomorrow you fly to Washington not as passengers, but as champions who've proven they belong in any room they enter." His philosophy had always been crystal clear, learned through decades of legal battles. Sometimes silence is power. It lets your opponents reveal their weaknesses. Sometimes silence is surrender. It allows injustice to flourish unchallenged. You'll know the difference when the moment arrives, and you'll have the courage to act accordingly. The twins had absorbed these lessons through years of dinner table conversations about justice, strategy, and the responsibility that came with their talents. They understood that their achievements weren't just personal victories. They were weapons against stereotypes, proof that excellence knows no racial boundaries. Meanwhile, across town, in a cramped apartment that reeked of disappointment and stale cigarettes, Janet Morrison stared at divorce papers scattered across her secondhand table, bills piling up like accusations she couldn't answer. Her 15-year career as a flight attendant was the only thing preventing complete financial collapse, and even that felt increasingly precarious as younger, more diverse crew members joined the airline. Janet had once dreamed of becoming a travel writer, exploring exotic destinations and crafting articles about cultural adventures. But life had beaten those dreams out of her through a series of rejections, failed relationships, and mounting debt that transformed hope into bitterness. Her recent divorce had revealed the ugly truth. She'd become the kind of person who blamed others for her failures rather than examining her own choices. She'd perfected the art of disguising her racial prejudice as professional standards, targeting minority passengers with microaggressions so subtle they could be dismissed as misunderstandings. A questioning look here, a comment about proper documentation there, subtle delays in service that made people feel unwelcome without creating actionable complaints. Janet had convinced herself these weren't racist acts, but rather maintaining the quality standards that first-class passengers expected. In her twisted logic, young black passengers in premium seats must have gotten there through charity or mistakes rather than merit, because admitting they'd earned their place would force her to confront her own mediocrity. The next morning, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport hummed with typical pre-flight energy as the Williams family navigated through first-class check-in. The contrast was striking. While other families stressed luggage weight and boarding procedures, the Williams moved with the confidence of people accustomed to excellence. This wasn't just any trip. This was Olivia and Nia's first solo flight, an independence test before their leadership summit that would prove they could handle themselves in any situation. Patrick had deliberately structured this challenge, understanding that real strength comes from facing adversity independently while knowing support was available if needed. The check-in agent, a young black woman named Kesha, beamed with recognition when she saw the twins' names on her screen. "Oh my goodness, you're the Williams sisters. I read about your debate championship and writing awards in the employee newsletter. You girls are amazing." Olivia and Nia exchanged surprised glances. They'd grown accustomed to being the only black faces in academic competitions, but seeing someone who looked like them in positions of authority always felt validating. "We're flying to the Youth Leadership Summit," Nia explained, her natural storytelling instincts turning a simple explanation into an engaging narrative. "It's kind of surreal. We're going to be in the same program that produced 3 Supreme Court justices and 2 presidents." Patrick watched this interaction with quiet pride, remembering his wife's words about representation matching. Hannah had always said that seeing successful black professionals in everyday situations was just as important as seeing them in headlines. It normalized excellence rather than treating it as an exception. As they approached the boarding gate, the airport's diversity painted a picture of modern America. Families of every background heading to destinations across the globe, each carrying their own dreams and challenges. But for the Williams family, this journey represented something deeper. Proof that merit could overcome prejudice, that excellence could open doors that bigotry tried to keep closed. Olivia and Nia radiated confidence that comes from knowing you've earned every opportunity through hard work alone. They carried themselves like the champions. They were heads high, shoulders back, ready to claim their rightful place in any room they entered. Their matching outfits were carefully chosen, professional blazers that commanded respect while remaining age-appropriate, a visual statement that they belonged in elite spaces. But the moment Janet Morrison spotted 2 young black girls boarding first class, her internal alarm system activated with venomous intensity. Her prejudiced mind immediately began calculating ways to assert dominance, to remind these children that her perception of their place mattered more than their achievements or ticket prices. Janet's 15 years of experience had taught her exactly how to target passengers without creating obvious discrimination complaints. She perfected the art of making people feel unwelcome through 1,000 tiny cuts, questioning documents that were clearly valid, providing slower service, making comments that could be interpreted as helpful but felt degrading to their targets. What would you do if you witnessed someone targeting children like this? Would you speak up immediately, record everything, or try to intervene? Let me know in the comments below because this story is about to test everyone's courage. As Flight 447 filled with passengers representing every demographic imaginable, an invisible social battlefield began forming. The first-class cabin housed a fascinating cross-section of American society. Tech executives, doctors, lawyers, retirees, and families treating themselves to luxury travel. Some travelers minded their own business, absorbed in phones or laptops. Others watched with growing discomfort as subtle tensions began building like electricity before a devastating storm. Patrick Williams settled into his seat across the aisle from his daughters, his trained legal mind already cataloging passenger reactions and flight crew behavior. He taught Olivia and Nia to handle discrimination with dignity and strength, but he also knew when parental intervention became necessary. His positioning was strategic, close enough to observe every interaction, far enough away to allow his daughter's independence. The plane's social dynamics painted a perfect microcosm of American society. Those who would stand up for justice, those who would look away from uncomfortable truths, and those who would record everything for social media without actually helping. But none of them understood they were about to witness a masterclass in how courage confronts hatred and how true power reveals itself when injustice goes too far. In row 5, Mrs. Chin, a retired civil rights activist, immediately sensed tension building. Her decades of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of racial targeting before they escalated into obvious discrimination. She'd lived through the civil rights movement, witnessed lynchings, and fought battles that paved the way for moments like this. Behind them, the Henderson family, white suburbanites from Connecticut, shifted uncomfortably as they noticed the flight attendants' unusual attention to the black teenagers. Their own daughters were similar ages, making the situation feel personal rather than abstract. In the business section, Jake Martinez, a Latino civil rights attorney, discreetly activated his phone's recording function. His legal training had taught him that documentation was crucial when witnessing potential discrimination, even if intervention wasn't immediately possible. Janet Morrison approached the twin seats with predatory focus, her 15 years of experience giving her confidence that she could intimidate two teenagers into submission. She had no idea she was about to make the biggest mistake of her career, targeting the daughters of a man whose silent presence would soon turn her world upside down. The pre-flight routine continued around them, passengers stowing luggage, flight attendants checking safety equipment, pilots reviewing flight plans. But beneath this mundane surface, forces were aligning for a confrontation that would expose ugly truths about modern racism, while proving that sometimes the most powerful responses come from the most unexpected sources. Olivia and Naya sat in their seats, reviewing summit materials and discussing their presentation strategies. They had no idea they were about to become reluctant symbols in a battle much larger than themselves. A fight that would test everything their parents had taught them about dignity, courage, and standing up to injustice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would go viral within hours, exposing the ugly reality of modern racism while proving that excellence cannot be diminished by ignorance, and that true power often wears the quietest mask. What happened next would haunt Janet Morrison for the rest of her career. But in that moment, drunk on her own perceived authority, she approached Olivia and Naya's seats like a predator circling wounded prey. Her smile was surgical in its coldness, practiced through years of making unwelcome passengers feel exactly that unwelcome. "Excuse me, girls." Janet's voice dripped with false sweetness that fooled no one. "I need to verify your boarding passes again. There seems to be some confusion about your seating assignments." Olivia looked up from her summit preparation materials, her debate-trained mind immediately recognizing the challenge. "We already showed our passes during boarding. Is there a specific problem?" But Janet was just getting started. This was her domain, her kingdom, 30,000 FT above the ground, and she intended to remind these children exactly who held the power here. Sometimes the computer system makes errors. Young passengers like yourselves usually fly in the main cabin. Are you sure you didn't accidentally board the wrong section? The insult hit like a slap. Nia's grip tightened on her journal, years of writing about injustice suddenly becoming a lived experience. "We're 14, not 4. We know how to read seat numbers." Janet's laugh was sharp, designed to cut. "Of course you do, sweetie. I'm just trying to help before there's any embarrassment later." Mrs. Chin, seated 2 rows back, felt her blood pressure spike. She'd witnessed this exact scenario in 1962 when flight attendants used confusion and computer errors to force black passengers into inferior accommodations. Some battles, she realized with crushing disappointment, were still being fought 60 years later. The Henderson family exchanged uncomfortable glances. Their teenage daughters would never be questioned this way, and that realization made them squirm in their premium leather seats. Privilege, they were learning, wasn't just about what you had, it was about what you never had to endure. Patrick Williams observed every micro-expression, every calculated pause in Janet's performance. His legal mind cataloged each violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. But his father's heart ached watching his daughters face the same prejudice that had tormented generations before them. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Janet's psychological warfare escalated with surgical precision. During the pre-flight beverage service, she approached every first-class passenger with warm professionalism, offering premium drinks, engaging in pleasant conversation, ensuring complete comfort. But when she reached Olivia and Nia, her demeanor shifted like a storm cloud blocking the sun. Water, she announced curtly, placing plastic cups in front of them without asking their preferences. Around them, other passengers sipped champagne, orange juice, and gourmet coffee from crystal glasses. The message was unmistakable. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you know it. Olivia's analytical mind began documenting every detail, understanding instinctively that this treatment wasn't accidental. Excuse me, could we see the beverage menu like everyone else received? Janet's smile could have frozen lava. This is what we have available for younger passengers. For safety reasons, Nia looked around the cabin, noticing other teenagers drinking the same beverages as adults. What safety reasons specifically? Company policy, Janet replied with the confidence of someone who'd perfected lying with authority. I don't make the rules, I just follow them. But Nia's observant writer's mind was recording everything. The way Janet's voice changed when addressing them, how her body language radiated hostility, the stark contrast between their treatment and every other passenger's experience. This wasn't customer service. This was systematic dehumanization, disguised as professionalism. During the safety demonstration, Janet positioned herself directly in front of the twins, blocking their view of the emergency exits presentation. When Olivia politely asked her to move slightly, Janet's response was loaded with condescension. Young ladies, I need you to pay attention instead of chatting. This information could save your lives. The irony was devastating. Janet was lecturing them about paying attention while deliberately obstructing their ability to see the safety presentation she claimed was so crucial. Jake Martinez, the civil rights attorney seated in business class, discreetly activated his phone's recording function. His years of experience had taught him that discrimination often escalated gradually, building from microaggressions to overt violations. He'd witnessed too many cases where victims couldn't prove their treatment because no one had documented the pattern of abuse. As Flight 447 reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into typical flight routines, passengers reading, working on laptops, or sleeping. But Janet's campaign of targeted harassment was just beginning. She seemed to find excuses to pass by the twins' seats every few minutes, each interaction designed to make them feel monitored, unwelcome, and uncomfortable. Girls, I need you to keep your personal items completely under the seats, she announced, despite their belongings being properly stowed exactly like every other passenger's. We have higher standards in first class. Olivia's debate training kicked in automatically. Could you show me the specific regulation you're referencing? I'd like to understand the exact requirement. Janet's eyes flashed with irritation. Smart passengers were always more difficult to intimidate than confused ones. I don't need to quote regulations to children. I need you to follow instructions without argument. The word children was wielded like a weapon designed to diminish their legitimacy and reduce them to powerless minors who should accept adult authority without question. But Janet had underestimated exactly who she was targeting. Nia looked up from her journal where she'd been documenting every interaction with timestamps and direct quotes. We're following all regulations. We're also not required to accept disrespectful treatment because of our age or any other characteristic. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. These weren't intimidated children. They were informed young women who understood their rights and weren't afraid to assert them politely but firmly. If you witnessed this systematic targeting of two young girls, would you speak up or stay silent? Comment below, because this story is about to show you exactly what real courage looks like when pushed to its breaking point. Mrs. Chun could no longer remain silent. At 78 years old, she'd survived Japanese internment camps, witnessed the civil rights movement, and spent decades fighting institutional racism. Watching these girls endure treatment she recognized from America's darkest chapters activated every protective instinct in her weathered body. She rose carefully from her seat, her small frame carrying the authority of someone who'd stared down hatred, and emerged victorious. Approaching Janet during another harassment cycle, Mrs. Chen's voice carried decades of hard-won wisdom. Excuse me, dear, but I've been flying for over 60 years, and I've never seen safety regulations applied so selectively. Her tone was grandmotherly sweet, but sharp as a blade. Perhaps you could clarify which specific policies require constant monitoring of these particular passengers. Janet found herself caught between maintaining her facade of professionalism and defending actions she couldn't justify without revealing their discriminatory nature. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm trained to ensure all passengers follow proper procedures. Mrs. Chen's smile was devastating in its gentleness. Of course, dear. I'm just curious why these procedures seem to only apply to certain passengers. In my experience, true professionalism means treating everyone with equal respect. The public nature of Mrs. Chen's intervention shifted the cabin's dynamics dramatically. Other passengers began paying closer attention, some pulling out phones to record, others whispering among themselves about the obvious disparity in treatment. The Henderson family, initially uncomfortable but passive observers, found their teenage daughters asking pointed questions that demanded honest answers. "Mom, why is that lady being so mean to those girls?" whispered their youngest. "Dad, would someone treat us like that?" asked their older daughter, her privilege suddenly feeling less like protection and more like responsibility. These questions forced the Henderson parents to confront truths they'd previously avoided. Their children were the same age as Olivia and Nia, but the difference in treatment was stark and undeniable. Silence wasn't neutral, it was complicity. Meanwhile, Olivia and Nia drew strength from Mrs. Chen's intervention, understanding that allies could emerge from unexpected places. Their mother's words echoed in their memory. Sometimes help comes from the most surprising sources. Never be too proud to accept support, but never be too dependent to stand on your own. Olivia decided to escalate strategically using her debate skills to expose Janet's inconsistencies publicly. "I'd like to understand the airline's policy on beverage service for passengers under 18. Could you provide the specific regulation that restricts our drink options?" Janet's confidence wavered slightly. Policies were typically vague enough to allow discriminatory interpretation, but direct questioning in front of witnesses made her position increasingly difficult to defend. "Company policy allows flight attendants to use discretion in service delivery," she replied, falling back on corporate language design to justify any action. Nia looked up from her journal where she'd been documenting every exchange. "Could you define discretion in this context? Because it appears your discretion results in different service standards based on passenger characteristics rather than actual behavior or legitimate safety concerns." The sophistication of these responses caught Janet off guard. These weren't typical teenagers she could intimidate with authority and confusion. They were articulate young women who understood systems, questioned inconsistencies, and documented everything with precision that would make lawyers proud. Jake Martinez, still recording from business class, recognized the twins' strategic approach. They weren't escalating emotionally or creating disruptions that could be used against them. Instead, they were methodically exposing discriminatory practices through calm, logical questioning that highlighted the absurdity of Janet's justifications. Other passengers began choosing sides, not necessarily vocally, but through body language and attention. Some continued ignoring the situation, desperate to avoid confrontation. Others started watching more intently, their phones recording evidence of what was becoming an undeniable pattern of harassment. A businessman in row 2 leaned toward his seatmate, whispering, "This is getting uncomfortable. Someone should say something." His companion, a middle-aged woman, replied quietly, "Those girls are handling themselves better than most adults would. They're not backing down." This recognition spread through the cabin like ripples on water. Passengers were witnessing something remarkable. Two young women refusing to be diminished by systematic prejudice, using intelligence and dignity as weapons against ignorance and hatred. But Janet Morrison, feeling increasingly cornered and publicly challenged, was about to make the catastrophic decision that would transform uncomfortable microaggressions into overt discrimination that even the most passive observers couldn't ignore. The turning point came when Janet decided that subtlety wasn't working. These girls were too smart, too articulate, and too confident for psychological warfare. If she was going to establish dominance, she needed to escalate to overt actions that would crush their resistance and remind everyone exactly who controlled this environment. During the meal service, Janet's discrimination became impossible to ignore. She served every first-class passenger personally, explaining menu options, offering wine pairings, and ensuring complete satisfaction. The presentation was elaborate. Meals plated beautifully, garnishes arranged perfectly, service delivered with professional warmth. When she reached Olivia and Nia, her demeanor shifted dramatically. Without offering choices or explanations, she dropped pre-packaged sandwiches in front of them, the kind served in economy class, still wrapped in plastic, looking sad and uninviting compared to the gourmet presentation surrounding them. "Here's your meal," Janet announced curtly, turning away before they could respond. Olivia stared at the sandwich, then looked around the cabin where other passengers enjoyed elaborate meals with multiple courses. The disparity was so obvious that even the most oblivious travelers couldn't miss it. "Excuse me," Olivia called out, her voice carrying the authority she'd developed through years of competitive debate. "I believe there's been an error with our meal service." Janet turned back with theatrical surprise. "Error? What kind of error?" Nia gestured toward the elaborate meals being served around them. Every other first-class passenger received the full meal service with options and presentation. We received pre-packaged sandwiches without any explanation or choice. The cabin fell silent. Conversation stopped. Passengers turned to watch what everyone now recognized as a confrontation that had moved beyond microaggressions into overt discrimination. Janet's response revealed the ugly truth she'd been hiding behind professional facades. "Young ladies, I think you'll find those meals are more appropriate for passengers your age. The adult menu might be too sophisticated for younger palates." The racism was now naked and undeniable. She wasn't even pretending her decisions were based on policies or safety concerns. She was openly stating that these black teenagers didn't deserve the same service as white passengers, disguising age discrimination as a thin cover for racial prejudice. Mrs. Chin gasped audibly. The Henderson family's teenage daughters stared in shock at treatment they couldn't imagine experiencing themselves. Jake Martinez's recording captured every word of Janet's self-incriminating statements. But Olivia Williams, daughter of a civil rights attorney and a neurosurgeon, granddaughter of sharecroppers who'd fought for basic dignity, wasn't backing down from someone who mistook her youth for weakness. "I'd like to speak with the captain," Olivia announced clearly, her voice carrying through the now silent cabin. "This treatment violates federal anti-discrimination laws, and I want it documented officially." Janet's mask slipped completely. "You'll speak to whoever I decide you can speak to. Until then, you'll eat what you're given and be grateful for it." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Every passenger heard them. Every phone captured them. Janet Morrison had just revealed herself as exactly what everyone now suspected. A racist whose professional facade couldn't hide her fundamental belief that these young black women didn't deserve basic human dignity. Nia closed her journal and stood up slowly, her mother's strength flowing through her veins. "We're not grateful for discrimination. We're not grateful for disrespect. And we're not going to accept treatment that violates both airline policies and federal law." The confrontation had reached its breaking point. Janet realized she'd exposed herself completely, but instead of backing down, she doubled down with the desperation of someone whose career was imploding in real time. "Sit down immediately or I'll have you removed from this aircraft for being disruptive and threatening crew members." The threat was absurd. Two polite teenagers asking for equal treatment were now being characterized as threats to flight safety. But Janet's panic was making her dangerous, and everyone in the cabin understood they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond the single flight. Patrick Williams had remained silent through his daughter's methodical exposure of discrimination, proud of their strategic approach, and confident in their ability to handle the situation independently. But Janet's threat to remove them from the aircraft crossed a line that activated every protective instinct in his body. The silent observer was about to become an active participant, and Janet Morrison was about to discover that targeting the wrong family could destroy more than just a career. It could freeze an entire airline. Have you ever witnessed discrimination this blatant? What would you do if someone threatened to remove children for standing up for their rights? Share your thoughts because what happens next will shock you to your core. The cabin had become a pressure cooker of tension, with passengers holding their breath as they witnessed two young women refuse to be broken by systematic racism. Janet Morrison, cornered by her own exposed prejudice and growing desperation, was about to make the fatal mistake that would transform her from airline employee to viral symbol of institutional discrimination. "Since you want to cause problems and disrupt other passengers' peaceful flight experience," Janet announced loudly enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear, "I'm calling security to have you removed when we land. You can explain your attitude to airport police. The threat was designed to terrify two teenagers into submission, but Janet had fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. These weren't random children she could intimidate. They were the daughters of Patrick Williams, raised to understand that backing down from injustice wasn't an option, even when the cost seemed overwhelming. Olivia's response was delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. On what grounds? We violated no regulations, threatened no one, and disrupted nothing. We've simply asked for equal treatment that we're legally entitled to receive, Nia added with devastating calm. Everything you've said and done has been witnessed by dozens of passengers and recorded on multiple devices. Are you certain you want to continue making statements that could be used in federal discrimination lawsuits? The sophistication of their responses sent shockwaves through the cabin. These weren't just articulate teenagers. They were young women who understood legal concepts, federal regulations, and the consequences of discriminatory actions. Janet was facing opponents who could match her word for word while maintaining moral and legal high ground. Mrs. Chin stood up again, her small frame radiating the authority of someone who'd witnessed history's darkest moments and refused to let them repeat unchallenged. Young lady, she addressed Janet with grandmotherly firmness, I survived internment camps where officials used similar justifications for unequal treatment. I'm not going to sit silently while children are terrorized for demanding basic dignity. Her words hit the cabin like thunder. Passengers who'd been passive observers suddenly understood they were witnessing a moment that connected directly to America's most shameful chapters. This wasn't just about airline service. It was about whether progress meant anything or if hatred could still hide behind uniforms and fake smiles. Jake Martinez made a decision that would prove crucial in the coming legal battles. Rising from his business class seat, he approached the first-class cabin with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to courtrooms and confrontation. Excuse me, he addressed Janet professionally. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law, and I've been documenting this entire interaction. Before you make any more statements or threats, you should understand that everything you've said constitutes prima facie evidence of discrimination based on race and age. Janet's world began crumbling in real time. An attorney was witnessing her actions, documenting her statements, and explaining their legal implications. The teenage passengers she tried to intimidate were revealing themselves as far more sophisticated than she'd imagined, and the cabin full of witnesses was no longer passive. They were actively supporting the twins against her. I don't need legal advice from passengers, Janet snapped, but her voice betrayed growing panic. I'm following company procedures and ensuring flight safety. Jake's smile was professional but devastating. Which specific procedures authorize different meal service based on passenger age or race? Which safety regulations require constant monitoring of certain passengers while ignoring others? I'd be fascinated to review the documentation that supports your actions. The systematic destruction of Janet's justifications was methodical and complete. Every excuse she'd offered was being dismantled by people who understood systems, regulations, and the difference between legitimate policies and discriminatory practices disguised as professionalism. But Janet Morrison, facing complete professional humiliation and legal exposure, was about to make the catastrophic decision that would elevate this incident from discrimination complaint to national news story. I'm the flight attendant, and I determine who threatens flight safety, she declared with the desperation of someone whose authority was evaporating. These passengers are being aggressive, disruptive, and threatening. I'm recommending they be met by security and potentially banned from future flights. The lies were so outrageous that passengers throughout the cabin began openly protesting. The Henderson family's father stood up, his privilege finally converted into action. That's completely false. These girls have been polite and respectful throughout this entire harassment campaign. A businessman from Roe added his voice. I've been watching this whole thing. The only person being aggressive is you. These kids have shown incredible restraint. Even passengers who'd initially tried to ignore the situation found themselves unable to remain silent when faced with such blatant lies about what they'd witnessed firsthand. But Olivia Williams, drawing on every lesson her father had taught her about strategic timing and maximum impact, was about to deliver the response that would change everything. "Before you make any more false statements," she announced clearly, "you should know that our father is Patrick Williams. He's not just a civil rights attorney. He's a major investor in this airline, and he's been watching every moment of your performance from seat 2A. The revelation hit the cabin like a bomb. Passengers turned to look at the distinguished black man who'd been silently observing the entire confrontation. Patrick Williams, who'd allowed his daughters to fight their own battle as long as possible, was about to demonstrate what happened when someone made the mistake of targeting his family. Janet's face went white as she realized the magnitude of her error. She'd been terrorizing the daughters of someone who could destroy her career with a phone call. But it was too late for backtracking. Every word had been recorded, every action witnessed, and every lie documented. The transformation in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and electric as Patrick Williams rose from his seat with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. His presence alone shifted every dynamic. Passengers straightened, conversations stopped, and even the background hum of the aircraft seemed to quiet in anticipation of what would come next. For 35 minutes, Patrick had watched his daughters handle discrimination with intelligence, dignity, and strategic precision that made his heart swell with pride. He'd seen them refuse to be diminished, document every violation, and maintain composure under pressure that would break many adults. They'd proven they could fight their own battles. Now it was time to ensure they won the war. Janet Morrison stood frozen as the full implications of her situation crashed over her like a tsunami. The quiet passenger she'd ignored, the man whose daughters she'd been terrorizing, wasn't just any concerned father. Patrick Williams owned enough airline stock to influence board decisions, enough legal expertise to destroy careers, and enough connections to ensure this story reached every major media outlet within hours. "Is there a problem with my daughters?" Patrick asked quietly, his voice carrying the kind of understated authority that made opposing attorneys surrender without fights. He didn't need to raise his voice. 30 years of legal victories had taught him that true power whispered while weakness shouted. Janet's response revealed the depth of her panic and the complete collapse of her professional facade. "Sir, I was just ensuring flight safety and following standard procedures for unaccompanied minor passengers." The lie was so pathetic, it would have been laughable if the situation weren't so serious. Olivia and Nia weren't unaccompanied minors. They were traveling independently with full-fare first-class tickets, and Janet had made no attempts to apply minor passenger protocols. She was desperately grasping for any justification that might minimize her legal exposure. Patrick's response was surgical in its precision. "My daughters are not unaccompanied minors. They're traveling on individual tickets in seats I purchased specifically for them. What procedures were you following that resulted in different meal service, constant harassment, and threats of removal?" The question hung in the air like a judicial order demanding answers that Janet couldn't provide without admitting to discrimination. Every passenger was listening. Multiple phones were recording. The legal noose was tightening with each word. There were concerns about their behavior and attitude. Janet stammered, falling back on coded language that had protected discriminatory actions for decades. Patrick's laugh was soft but devastating. "Their behavior, let me describe what I observed. My daughters boarded politely, sat quietly, responded respectfully to questions, and documented violations of their civil rights with remarkable restraint. The only problematic behavior I witnessed came from an employee who systematically violated federal anti-discrimination laws." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle throughout the cabin before delivering the knockout blow. "I'm Patrick Williams. I'm a civil rights attorney who's won landmark cases against major corporations for exactly this type of discrimination. I'm also a significant investor in this airline, which means your employer's board of directors has my personal phone number. Would you like to continue explaining your procedures to me?" The revelation sent shockwaves through every corner of the aircraft. Janet's face drained of all color as she realized she'd been targeting the family of someone who could single-handedly destroy her career and potentially damage the entire airline. Passengers who'd been recording pulled out phones to capture every moment of what was clearly becoming a historic confrontation. Mrs. Chun clasped her hands together in satisfaction, recognizing the moment when justice finally had the tools to fight back effectively. The Henderson family exchanged amazed glances, understanding they were witnessing David and Goliath with roles reversed. The giant this time wore a father's protective love and carried weapons of legal expertise and economic influence. Patrick continued with the methodical precision that had made him legendary in courtrooms across the nation. Over the past 35 minutes, I've documented systematic discrimination based on race and age, differential service delivery, false policy citations, intimidation tactics, and threats of removal without cause. Every action captured on multiple recording devices by witnesses from various backgrounds. He gestured toward the passengers around them. Mrs. Chun survived internment camps and recognizes institutional prejudice. The Henderson family witnessed treatment their own children would never receive. Mr. Martinez is a civil rights attorney who's been documenting everything for potential legal proceedings. You've provided us with a textbook case of discrimination with perfect evidence and multiple witnesses. Janet tried one last desperate defense. I was just doing my job and following company policies. Patrick's interruption was gentle but final. No, you were violating federal law while representing an airline I partially own. And now you're going to discover exactly what happens when someone makes the mistake of targeting my family. Without another word, Patrick walked calmly toward the cockpit, his movement triggering whispers throughout the cabin as passengers realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Where's he going? Someone whispered. To talk to the captain, another replied. This is about to get very real, Jake Martinez murmured, understanding the legal and financial implications of what was unfolding. Patrick Williams' walk to the front of the aircraft felt like a funeral march for Janet Morrison's career. Each step carried the weight of legal precedent, economic influence, and a father's righteous fury channeled through decades of professional expertise. Passengers craned their necks to watch, understanding they were witnessing the moment when institutional power collided with individual accountability. The cockpit door, normally a barrier between passengers and crew, opened immediately when Patrick knocked. His reputation in civil rights law and his status as a major airline investor meant that Captain Rodriguez knew exactly who was requesting an audience and why such a conversation might be necessary. Captain Rodriguez, I'm Patrick Williams. We need to discuss a serious situation involving systematic discrimination against my daughters by your flight attendant. The conversation that followed was brief but devastating. Patrick presented the facts with legal precision, documented evidence of discriminatory service, threats against minors, violations of federal anti-discrimination laws, and potential liability for the airline that could reach tens of millions of dollars in settlements and punitive damages. Captain Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran who'd never faced anything approaching this level of legal and public relations disaster, immediately understood the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a customer service complaint. It was a federal civil rights violation committed by his crew member against the daughters of someone who could destroy the airline's reputation and financial standing. Mr. Williams, I need 5 minutes to contact our headquarters and legal department. This aircraft is not moving until we resolve this situation appropriately. Those words transmitted over the intercom to air traffic control began a chain reaction that would ripple through the aviation industry within hours. Flight 447, originally scheduled for immediate takeoff, came to a complete halt on the runway as emergency legal consultations began at $30,000. Back in the cabin, passengers felt the plane's engines wind down and heard the captain's announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to an administrative matter. We'll provide updates as they become available, but seasoned travelers understood that planes don't stop on runways for administrative matters. Something extraordinary was happening, and the whispers began immediately. This is about those girls and the flight attendant, someone murmured. That man who went to the cockpit, he said he was an airline investor. Another passenger added, she's in serious trouble. Mrs. Chin observed with satisfaction. Justice is finally being served. Janet Morrison stood in the aisle, her world collapsing around her as she realized the true scope of her mistake. The quiet passenger she'd ignored had turned out to be a civil rights attorney with the power to end her career. The teenagers she tried to intimidate had documented every violation with legal precision. The witnesses she performed in front of were now actively supporting the discrimination case against her. 15 minutes later, Patrick Williams emerged from the cockpit with Captain Rodriguez. both men wearing expressions that made Janet's blood run cold. The captain carried official documentation and a company phone, while Patrick held his own device, showing multiple missed calls from airline executives who were frantically trying to contain a public relations and legal nightmare. Ms. Morrison, Captain Rodriguez, addressed Janet with the formality reserved for termination proceedings. You're being relieved of duties immediately pending a full investigation into allegations of discrimination and violation of federal civil rights laws. The words hit the cabin like thunder. Passengers who'd witnessed the entire confrontation felt vindication and justice being served in real time. Janet's systematic campaign of harassment had finally met consequences that matched the severity of her actions. But Patrick wasn't finished. Rising to address the entire first-class cabin, he delivered words that would be shared across social media within minutes and remembered for years as a masterclass in dignity defeating prejudice. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today wasn't just poor customer service. It was systematic discrimination that violates everything America claims to stand for. My daughters refused to accept unequal treatment, documented violations of their civil rights, and maintained dignity under pressure that would break many adults. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting institutional racism and winning. This flight attendant tried to make them feel small because of their race and age. She failed because excellence cannot be diminished by ignorance and character cannot be defeated by hatred. The applause that erupted was spontaneous and sustained. Passengers who'd been silent witnesses became active supporters, their phones capturing a moment when justice triumphed over prejudice through courage, preparation, and the power of documented truth. If you're feeling the power of this moment where justice finally wins, hit that subscribe button because the resolution of this story will restore your faith in fighting back against discrimination. The atmosphere in Flight 447's first-class cabin had transformed from tension and conflict to something approaching a courtroom where justice was finally being served. Passengers who'd witnessed 35 minutes of systematic discrimination now watched as consequences unfolded with the precision of a legal proceeding and the satisfaction of moral victory. Captain Rodriguez returned to the cabin carrying official airline documentation and wearing the expression of someone who just received emergency instructions from corporate headquarters. The phone calls from executives had been frantic, desperate, and crystal clear in their message. This situation required immediate, comprehensive, and public resolution that could minimize the catastrophic legal and public relations damage already spiraling beyond control. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain announced to the entire first-class section, I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable treatment witnessed today. Ms. Morrison's actions violated both airline policies and federal anti-discrimination laws. She has been suspended immediately pending termination, and this incident will be reported to federal authorities for potential criminal prosecution. The words carried the weight of official acknowledgement that what passengers had witnessed wasn't ambiguous or subjective. It was clear-cut discrimination that violated multiple laws and regulations. Janet Morrison's career wasn't just ending, it was being incinerated by her own documented actions. Patrick Williams stood beside his daughters, one hand on each of their shoulders, as he addressed the cabin with the authority of someone who'd spent decades turning individual injustices into systemic changes. What my daughters experience today happens to countless young people across this country every day. The difference is that Olivia and Neo were prepared, protected, and supported. They understood their rights, documented violations, and refused to accept unequal treatment even when facing adult authority figures in positions of power. His voice carried throughout the cabin as passengers leaned forward to capture every word. This flight attendant tried to strip them of dignity because she believed their age and race made them vulnerable targets. She was wrong on every level. They are brilliant young women who've earned every opportunity through excellence, and they proved today that courage and preparation can defeat prejudice and ignorance. Olivia, who'd maintained composure throughout the entire ordeal, finally allowed emotion to show in her voice as she addressed her fellow passengers. We didn't want this confrontation, but we couldn't accept treatment that violated our rights and dignity. Our mother taught us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity with oppression. Nia added, her writer's instincts turning personal experience into universal truth. Everyone on this plane witnessed how discrimination works in real time, subtle at first, then escalating when targets refuse to be diminished. You also saw how documentation, courage, and allies can turn victims into victors. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt. Passengers recognizing they'd witnessed something far more significant than an airline incident. They'd seen a masterclass in civil rights activism, evidence that the next generation was prepared to fight injustice with intelligence and dignity. Even before Flight 447 resumed its journey to Washington, D.C., the story was exploding across social media platforms with the speed and intensity of a wildfire in drought conditions. Passenger recordings captured every moment of the confrontation, from Janet's initial discriminatory comments through Patrick Williams' devastating revelation of his identity and influence. Within 2 hours of the first post going live, Nasher flight discrimination was trending on Twitter with over 100,000 shares. TikTok videos analyzing the twins' strategic responses reached millions of views as young people celebrated seeing teenagers who refused to be intimidated by adult authority figures wielding institutional power. The airline's stock price began dropping in after-hours trading as investors realized the company faced massive legal liability, federal investigations, and public relations damage that could take years to repair. Emergency board meetings convened as executives scrambled to contain a story that was growing beyond their control with each passing hour. News outlets picked up the story with the speed of organizations that understood they were witnessing a perfect storm of racial discrimination, generational courage, and social media documentation that created irresistible content for audiences hungry for justice narratives. Social media analysis revealed fascinating demographic patterns in the story spread. Young people shared it as inspiration for standing up to authority figures. Parents shared it as an example of raising children who could handle adversity independently. Legal professionals shared it as a textbook case of how to document discrimination effectively. Civil rights organizations seized on the incident as a perfect teaching moment, highlighting how institutional racism operated in modern America and how strategic responses could create systemic change rather than just individual resolution. The story's appeal crossed political and demographic boundaries because it featured elements that resonated universally. Young people standing up to injustice, parents protecting their children, and institutional accountability being enforced through courage and preparation rather than violence or disruption. What's your biggest takeaway from Olivia and Nia's incredible story of courage defeating hatred? Share your thoughts in the comments because their example shows us all how to turn moments of injustice into movements for change.